33-story hotel and condo project.
I'd probably be
okay,
like
like
that.
stop, tap.
This is a plan by the community for the community.
This one here, you showed me.
No problem, Ken. Thanks for having me.
It's Kent Mulga. And we're joined by David Brown from Kent Employment Law. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me back.
This is a dangerous topic. You know, hockey is so close to the heart for Canadians, and people love the WHL.
They sure do.
This case takes on the WHL. So it's a real sort of apple pie motherhood kind of issue here. But do you think that this class action suit truly stands a chance of winning?
From what we're looking at right now, there's one really central issue in this case, and that's whether or not players that are playing on WHL teams are employees or whether they're amateur athletes that are playing on some club, right? And at what point do we kind of cross that threshold from being a kid playing hockey to becoming a professional hockey player? And it seems like the WHL is kind of right on the cusp of that. And so where the class action lawsuit's going right now is they're saying that effectively these players are employees.
Yeah.
That's the position of the plaintiffs in this case. And that therefore they're entitled to basic employment rights that are provided for under the Employment Standards Act.
Minimum wage, vacation pay.
Overtime, absolutely, statutory holiday pay, and so on and so on. These are all rights that are protected under the Act.
When kids join this league, they do sign an agreement that seems an awful lot like an employment agreement.
There's a player's contract that they do sign, and the player's contract, although I haven't read one in myself in any detail, it does provide for weekly allowances. It provides for some education allotments to say that if you play for our team, we will be providing you with bursaries and scholarships and support if you go on to post-secondary education. And of course, there are other benefits. But I guess fundamentally, when you think about this, you have these hockey teams which charge gate admission, which have expenses, which have coaches that they pay, which have concession revenues that they earn. These are for-profit enterprises. Whether or not they make money is a different question, but ultimately their goal is to make money.
Right.
And then you have these players who are athletes and they're essentially, entertainers. They're providing a spectacle for a crowd, and they're not provided with minimum wage. That's the question. Are they an employee or are they an amateur athlete that can provide this service without compensation?
When I hear people discussing this, the most sort of earnest argument in favor of the WHL is that, hey, if you go ahead with something like this, we'll just have teams folding right, left, and center. Is that a defense? The fact that at least some of the teams wouldn't be in a position to make good on such judgment?
And that is not a valid legal defense necessarily, although it may be kind of a practical or a reality defense. And here's what I mean by that. I've been before the Employment Standards Branch many times, and I've heard many employers that I've defended or that I've gone up against who have pled poverty and said, you know what, we don't have money to do this. That does not go around their obligations that they have to their employees. Fundamentally, you have to be able to provide your employees with the compensation that's provided for in their contract and under the Employment Standards Act, right? Now, that being said, hockey is always different, right? This is something that we're speaking in Kelowna here. We love our Rockets, and if the estimates are accurate, that now the team's going to have to potentially be paying out about $300,000 a year in salaries to their players, this could put the team into jeopardy. So I know that there's been a lot of lobbying been done by teams across BC and across Canada, for that matter.
And in BC, that's why we wound up with some provincial legislation that, in effect, blocks the liability of the teams.
Yeah, so to speak. In February of 2016, right when this class action lawsuit was kind of coming to light and was heating up, the Liberal government of the day issued an order in council. It's not quite the same as a law. It's not quite the same as a regulation. Essentially, it's a directive that the government is passing down, saying that we consider these players to be athletes and not employees. So, arguably...
Could a judge say, I reject that?
I don't think so, unless there's some kind of constitutionality question behind that. What would more likely happen is the current government, our NDP, who at the time was outspoken against this change and saying that we shouldn't be interfering in a private relationship between a player, an employee/employee, or a company. They may essentially rescind that or issue their own directives as to how they see it being processed.
That could be struck down. And then the other thing is, being a class action suit, I take it that players who could wind up benefiting from this don't need to sign on. They can sit back and see how it turns out. And if it goes in their favor, they're in for a paycheck without even having to put their name forward now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So if you actually look at the court documents that were filed, because that I'm aware of, there are two main applications that were filed. One was in Ontario, one was in Alberta for the WHL, the Ontario is for the Ontario Hockey League. I believe there's another one also in the Quebec Major Junior League. But if you look at the two that were in Ontario and in Alberta, there's only one plaintiff who is bringing this forward as a class action on behalf of all players that were involved in that league. And they named as defendants basically every team in the CHL, including in the United States. So you're absolutely right that not everybody, every past player does not need to come forward and put their name on this docket. One person can bring it forward as a whole, and if it's certified, then all of these other players that have been impacted by the decision could receive a payout.
I don't want to get caught in the weeds here, but how far back does this go? And we've got teams that change hands. How far back in history can they be responsible to make these sorts of payments?
Yeah, my understanding, now granted I'm not an expert in class action lawsuits, this is a very niche area, so I want to kind of just put that caveat out there. Yeah. But we've got limitations of actions statutes across the country. So in British Columbia, for instance, we can typically go back 2 years in order to bring an action forward. So I guess arguably, if there's a claim that's being made for unpaid wages, unpaid overtime, and other contractual or statutory benefits, they may be able to make that claim and go back 2 years. Now, on top of that, we're talking about employment standards though. And in British Columbia, just like in Alberta and other jurisdictions, again, there's a different limitation. In BC, you have 6 months to file an employment standards complaint. So it'll be interesting to see how the courts parse that all out. Are they going to be holding these claimants to a 6-month limitation? Or are we going to be looking at 2 years? Or are we looking at longer lengths of time?
So just doubling back to the fact that it's a bit of a motherhood issue, hockey. What about tradition? What about the fact that it's always been this way? Is there such a defense? This is the way it's been done. People understand it. They know what it's like going in. Mm-hmm. Is that part of? Is
there some kind of precedent? Right.
Yeah.
Again, this is going to come back to the question: is this an employee, or are these players just volunteer athletes, amateur athletes? Right. And how we look at this is if the courts recognize that there's an employment agreement in place, that they are in fact employees, you cannot contract out of the Employment Standards Act. You cannot contract, so if the Employment Standards Act says that these people are entitled to overtime after 40 hours a week, as an employer, you can't say, oh, by the way, sign this agreement saying that you're not entitled to overtime. And that would essentially be the argument here, that this idea of precedent, we've always done it this way, this is how we operate, it doesn't fly if they've been considered to be employees.
If this was to be successful, other areas of employment come to mind, like paper boys who get paid. I think it doesn't add up to minimum wage. Are we going to start knocking down all these opportunities for young people to earn some pocket change?
Yeah. So when we're talking about these kinds of I guess industries or jobs, babysitters and paper routes and the like, there's no. So under the Employment Standards Act and the associated regulations, there's a number of jobs that are exempt, okay? Babysitting is a very good example of this, right? I have a babysitter, and I'm pretty confident I don't pay her minimum wage, right? But that being said, my 13 or 14-year-old babysitter is an exempt class under the Act. So that's a private arrangement we have, and we can do that, right?
So why aren't hockey players? Could that just be made to be part of that group of exemptions?
It certainly could. So if the government wanted to protect hockey players from earning basic minimum wage.
Protect them from earning minimum wage. It's a funny way to put it. But if they wanted to parcel it in, the courts would have that.
They certainly could. So the government, the proper way, in my view, of doing this was that they would pass regulations. They would amend the current regulations of the Employment Standards Act and create a category saying that hockey players in the Western Hockey League and other major junior leagues are exempt from the hours of work provisions in the Employment Standards Act.
Right. Which way would you bet on this one?
Huh. It's a political issue, and it's so if I'm looking at the Alberta action, recognizing that we've got this directive in BC, which is kind of going to parcel us out. There's a pretty compelling case here to be said that these are in fact employees, and my thinking behind this is, if this, like, just, you know, in some hypothetical world, if the Western Hockey League and the individual hockey clubs that run this, if they were like a government agency or if they were like a nonprofit agency and we're saying we're doing a call out for volunteers and this is what we can do, okay, yeah, maybe in that kind of a scenario. But at their core, these are for-profit capitalist enterprises, right? Again, like I said, whether or not they make money is kind of a different question, because I know there's lots of teams that lose money on a regular basis, right? But a for-profit company cannot not pay its workers, right?
Yeah.
So if you have essentially the stars of your show, like think of any other kind of entertainment world. You know, I don't know, a circus or something like that. You have to pay your acrobats. You have to pay your lion tamers. You have to pay your clowns, right? And I'm trying to, it's kind of a silly example here, but when you think of a stadium like Prospera Place that has 5,000 or 6,000 people that have all paid a price of admission to come and view a team that, you know, the owners of the team are going to get gate proceeds and everything else, and I recognize they got expenses, but these are athletes, but they're also entertainers. They're offering a product to the community and that people are paying to see. And at the end of the day, if the teams are making money, that's going into their ownership's pocket. And so why would we create a distinction for a major junior hockey team that we would not make for the convenience store down the road, or that we would not make for the business that's struggling to make ends meet?
It's going to be fascinating to see how this turns out.
Yeah, it certainly will, yeah.
Thanks for helping us understand it better.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
David Brown from Kent Employment Law. You're watching Kelowna Now.